was this. Good morning. And good morning to those of you out in virtual space. Hi, Ron. I remember our conversation in San Diego. I was actually thinking about it this morning, so I may tell the story. This is a wonderful opportunity. Mary said yesterday, the day before, why did I say I was going last? You know, I'm always last. My name starts with a W. So I am actually quite delighted to be last because I get to weave with Sheila and Ken and Mary and Harleen and David. And so there are some things that I want to say. And the first is, as you know me now, I live here. This is where I live. With this premise that we are all connected. That's a starting point for me. That we are all there. And that, in fact, I had this wonderful conversation with John Reisman over dinner last night that I'll tell you a little more about, but about mysticism and how we see that in relation to social constructionism. And so I woke up and I went, oh, I finally know what God is. God is a co-creative process. God isn't a man up there somewhere with a long beard, and we're all part of that. So this is where I live now. But I want to come over here to that funny guy and start a little bit with my journey. I had an interesting kind of along the way, and I want to begin with a phrase that I actually think may come from Frank Barrett, but I'm not quite sure where it comes from. Because those of us in this world of appreciative inquiry, we tend to speak in the plural, we, and we tend to use the same language. Isn't that how communities of practice are? But we use a phrase called words create worlds. And that notion of words is an important one. It's been important to me. I grew up with two grandmothers of just amazing impact on me. My Italian grandmother didn't speak English. The little bit that she knew, she learned by going to movies. And so I have a comfort being in worlds, places where people speak a language and I don't have a clue what they're saying, but I totally understand what's going on. It's an odd sensibility. And I had another grandmother who was a cleaning lady. And you know how the rich people give broken things to the people who are their cleaning people? So she always had a story. Something was given to her by Mrs. Jones or Mrs. Smith, and it's so valuable. And so she was a storyteller par excellence. So I had this one grandmother who just said, go to school, get an education. And another grandmother who just told stories. Everything was a wonder in a story. And I went off to college and thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. Perry Mason, and a defender of the underdog. I wanted to be a lawyer to fight for the good. And I was a debater. Anybody here a debater in high school or college? And I came upon a professor who said, you know, whatever the issue is, you will argue both sides. And by the way, you'll use it with the same data. So you get a kind of sense of irreverence for reality. That you're going to learn to make arguments using what's considered evidence and data. But you're going to go either way with it. And that was kind of interesting. You know, there's no right. We're going to kind of make it up. And it had enough competition for me that it had my attention. You know, if we could put together a good case, we could win. And so words and the way we put them together became very interesting to me. I was in communication, and so my entryway into constructionism. I had another professor who, at the time, there were these categories of communication: informative communication, persuasive communication. And he said, there's nothing but persuasive communication. Everything we say or do is having an impact, an influence. We're in this always creating, as Ken said, confluence. We didn't have that wonderful word at the time. But we're always, and so with appreciative inquiry, we say there's no neutral questions. That the questions we ask are fateful. So the other thing that was intriguing to me early on in my life was that I studied rhetorical theory, and I studied the contemporary rhetorical theory, the women's movement. And there was a time where a book and a phrase sort of was transformative. The phrase, sisterhood is powerful. That phrase made a difference. And I thought, wow, is that a metaphor? Is that what we mean? But what happens that a whole groups of people coalesce around that phrase? Another one, black is beautiful. These phrases emerge somehow through somebody saying them, writing them, but there's something about the time and the place and what's happening that then they begin to carry and give new possibilities for people. And so when we understand language as a part of our constructionist toolkit, maybe, we understand that it liberates certain possibilities and it limits others. But to that question of liberation and what stories do we tell has been important to me. So I've been very intrigued with that. And along comes appreciative inquiry and this notion of inquiry. Now, I didn't grow up implicitly curious. I grew up with a Marine Corps father in an Italian family. There's just a little bit of authority there. Oh, and let's add that I'm the eldest and the only girl with 3 brothers. And so before all this happened, was a very authoritarian kind of world. And so then I get into these worlds when my son was in law school, and he's in a study group, and they're working together, and they're writing papers together, and they're taking tests together. I said, when I went to college, that's called cheating. And now it's collaborative learning. So this move from the individual and the sort of authority top down, has been growing. And I think we're all living in that, in the story that Ken told. The other thing that was intriguing to me about my life, how many of you have cereal for breakfast? And you grew up in cars. When you were a kid, did you ever know that they were created by corporations? I had no idea that I'd be working in these large entities called a corporation. And so I was in graduate school and I'm studying communication, but I got interested in these bigger things. So I sort of then studied in the School of Business and organizational theory. And I began to wonder about the bigger things. So my own curiosities have always been what we call large scale. And I know that there are some of you here who work in organizations with all of these wonderful ideas and practices. And there are some of you who work about the organization. And that's how I would kind of talk about my work. It's not within the organization, but it's about the nature of organizing an organization. So words are one of the important bits. Words create worlds. The questions we ask are fateful. But then we come along to this other notion of wholeness. And I want to kind of look at Sheila's picture. Thank you both for making these beautiful illustrations of what I wanted to talk about. So I live in a world where this picture of Sheila's, this would be called marketing. This is probably called engineering. We might call this HR, human resources. Or in another organization, we might call this the Muslims. And we might call this the Catholics. And over here we have the Protestants. And you know how it goes. And so all of these conversational cycles, coordinated cycles are going on. They're going on in each of us. They're going on out in the world. And that's kind of organizing. Now, David talks about wholeness. We talk about wholeness. I wonder what it means to be attending to the whole. And I want to give you an example. Again, you know, in appreciative inquiry, we talk about the whole system in the room. And we mean that. I mean everybody. Everyone whose future it is needs to be in the conversation about the future. You know, otherwise we're just doing that same old thing where a few of the people are creating the future and trying to roll it down, cascade. I always call that steamrolling, rolling over people. So here's a story. Some of you may have heard this. Got a phone call from a young woman who worked for the Idaho State Department of Education. And she said to me, we need an appreciative inquiry summit. Now that always makes me nervous when somebody wants appreciative inquiry. Like, what for? Why? Because again, these are ways of working, but we just don't do it for the sake of doing it. And she said, well, here's the story. I work for the Department of Education. We're in a state that happens to have a very good school for students who are deaf and blind. It's one of the best in the country. Families move from other states to come and have their students, their children in this school. And a couple of years ago, one of our state legislators was at a party, maybe had a little too much to drink, and made a comment, you know, we should close the school. We could probably save money and provide the services in another way. That comment, innocent that it may have been, somehow got into the newspaper. And then it became reality. And we're 2 years later, and there is nothing that they seem to be able to do to end this myth. There is no actual conversation about closing the school. There are no plans to do that. And yet, teachers are leaving because they're afraid of their jobs. Families are moving away because they think the school will close. And it's just a story that got started. So they feel like they've got to bring everybody together. And they've got to help change that story. So who would you bring together? Who are all the stakeholders that have to be in the room in a situation like that?
Students.
The students who are deaf, the students who are blind. That, by the way, means you probably need some seeing eye dogs in the room too. Okay, we did that. Who else? Parents of both. Graduates of the school who are deaf and blind. Let's talk about the state legislature, the governor's office, the Department of Education, the business people, the teachers at the school, the administrators of the school, and by the way, the public. The advocacy groups, the ones who thought they were doing good work and the ones who thought the school wasn't doing enough. Now imagine, we planned for about 250 people, a room a bit larger than this. I had a place where I could stand because I had to wear a certain microphone that had appropriate sensibilities for people. When we planned breaks, we had to plan breaks for where the seeing eye dogs would have their break. It was phenomenal. Flip charts at every table, along with Braille recorders at every table. We had people who do sign language at every table, 2 of them, because I learned you can do sign for about 20 minutes and then you have to trade off. And we had to have this open to the public because it was a state government funded service. So we thought we might have 250 people, but on that day anyone could come. So there we are. And everyone is thinking, what is this about? If we made the conversation about the school, what would we be doing? We'd set up that dichotomy. should it, shouldn't. And there's not room for creative conversation. And so when we talk about appreciative inquiry, we talk about starting topic. And so it was a summit on educational services for students who are deaf and blind. And the school was one part of that. And so when I talk about whole, that's what I mean. Bringing all of the people into one coordinated conversation that allows them together to come out with a result, a set of understandings. In this case, a consensual decision to keep the school, and a set of recommendations that then went to the State Department of Education for approval and onto the state legislature for budgeting. So understanding that we can do these practices very large scale, right? But they are designed, and that's where David and I think, have a very strong common stance. We don't just say, okay, let's start a conversation in a room with 200 people and see where it goes. It's designed for a purpose, and it's designed because there's a content that we want people to engage in with all of their creativity, but it's also designed so that people can have a one-to-one presence and feel at ease themselves. Then they move into a small conversation in which then there's a kind of meaning-making in a smaller whole, and then there's a voice of the plenary. And so appreciative inquiry is not just about the questions we ask, it's about a kind of structure of conversation that allows us to move kind of from, we come in all with different views, we get to share those views, and yet we go out feeling as if we have done something together. So that sense of wholeness is very important. Dawn already gave me my 5-minute signal, so I have to go really fast for my next two things. The third piece for me is this question of ways of knowing. And I am delighted. We have language. Mary and Ken have brought this performance thing to us. We have ways of expressing and ways of knowing. Sarah's in the back. She's bringing us the artist as not only a way of knowing and a way of expressing, but another kind of vocabulary. I want to put forth yet one more. And I want us to consider, and this is perhaps my edginess, Ken, out here, that we might consider a contemplative constructionism. That there are, for some of us, a kind of contemplative nature in which we do have that relationship with the mystery. That as soon as you think you got it, it changes. You know, that's kind of one of the natural laws. And so there are many in here, whether we're Buddhists, we're shamanic, we're deeply Catholic, who have contemplative practices. And I think that they're an equally important way of knowing and way of expressing into a whole conversation as language and performance and art. And I have one more little idea that's going to be really fast, and that is the final bit for the future is another W, and that's wealth. And I think, I hope that we continue our explorations on personal dignity. What is it that helps people feel that they are worthwhile? Because yes, we may have somehow or another taken ourself out of the story of meaning making, but we are all people. And there's this sort of need to feel worthy. And I think our economic systems are intimately related to that. So if there's anyone who's curious in doing PhD studies on how we socially construct currency and economies, I would love to work with you, because I think that's a cutting edge. And so with that, I say namaste and thank you.